Welcome to Inside Crime, the experts. In this series, we'll bring you updates on what is making the news in the crime genre in Australia and around the world. Our experts will take you inside some of the most challenging crimes and mysteries. Many of these are unsolved. They're the stories of serial killers, murders, organised crime, disappearances, scams, frauds and heists, all part of the rich tapestry of crime. And now to our experts. Tim Watson-Munro is Australia's leading criminal psychologist. He's delved into the minds and crimes of some of the most notorious criminals in Australia and around the globe. Dr. Xanthi Mallet is a world-renowned criminologist and Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of Newcastle. And lastly, I'm Duncan McNabb. I started my life of crime as a detective in policing and criminal defence and in the corporate sector before heading to the media as an investigative journalist, author and documentary maker. And now to some news updates. The ruthless and homicidal Mexican drug cartels are back on the front page with the arrest of the Sinaloa cartel's head, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, and his cohort, Joaquin Guzman Lopez, in El Paso, Texas. Allegedly, the pair were lured onto a private jet, the cartel boss's favourite mode of transport, but rather than flying to look at Mexican real estate, they were flown to Texas and into the waiting arms of the US authorities. El Mayo founded the cartel 3 decades ago with Shorty El Chapo Guzman, and Joaquin is a son from Shorty's second marriage. The cartel has grown to be a massive influence in cocaine, amphetamine, and opioid trafficking around the world. Australia is a major market. Shorty Guzman is a serial escapee from prison, and he was caught and extradited to the US and sentenced to life plus 30 years in July 2019 and ordered to forfeit more than $12.6 billion US dollars. Repeat, $12.6 billion dollars. He's now in supermax prison and hopefully soon to be joined by these two other utter villains. In Queensland, the inquest into the December 2022 Wiembilla massacre of police constables Matthew Arnold and Rachel McCrow and civilian Alan Dare has begun. Their heavily armed attackers Nathaniel, Gareth and Stacey Train were later killed by police. The court has seen disturbing body cam footage from an officer who survived. We'll keep you updated as that inquest continues. Now to our story of the week. Robert Farquharson was behind the wheel of a car on the night of Father's Day 2005 when he crashed into a 7-metre deep dam near Winchelsea, southwest of Melbourne. His 3 sons, Jai 10, Tyler 7 and Bailey 2, drowned in the car that night. Farquharson swam free of the wreck and was the sole survivor. In 2 ensuing trials, 2007 and 2010, juries found him guilty of murdering his children. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 33 years to serve. His appeals failed, but now there is another appeal looming, driven by contemporary scientific evidence that may strike at the heart of the earlier prosecution case. And with that, over to our experts.
It's a fascinating and tragic case. His defence was that he had a coughing fit, cough syncope, which caused him to black out. And as a consequence of losing consciousness, he lost control of the vehicle, which veered into the dam. There was expert evidence to this effect. There was rebuttal evidence. And what's happening now is another expert is suggesting that there may have been a miscarriage of justice, that in fact the cough syncope may have been real, and Robert Farquharson is an innocent man. And there's now a number of experts who are joining the call, perhaps for an appeal, a retrial, on the basis of a possible miscarriage of justice, including the head of the Australian Academy of Sciences, who was also responsible for supporting the release of Kathleen Folberg, who's now back in the community, having spent an extensive period of time in jail, as indeed has Robert Farquharson. It'll be interesting to see whether he's given leave to appeal, and then it'll be the battle of the experts at 40 paces, I suspect.
Yeah, I think they're looking at a number of different types of evidence, aren't they? The medical evidence, obviously, which you just mentioned. There was traffic reconstruction evidence, which I think has been called into question as well as, and the evidence looking at how quickly the vehicle would have actually sunk into that dam. And I think all of those different elements will have to be reinvestigated to determine what was the actual course of events on that day.
There was also evidence about his demeanour following this tragedy, that he broke free from the car, he went to the side of the lake, People offered to dive in and try and rescue the children, and all he wanted to do was go and see the mother of the children, advise of what occurred. Evidence was led in the trial from a leading expert on post-traumatic stress disorder and its consequences, and Dr. Rob Gordon. And he said, look, you can never predict how people will react in times of high stress and trauma. I endorse that. I've examined a lot of people over the years that have confronted extraordinarily difficult circumstances. People who survived, for example, the Hoddle Street Massacre, the Queen Street Massacre. You cannot predict how people are going to react. But there was a lot of evidence placed on his behaviour suggesting that it was willful, deliberate, and that his inability to go back looking for the children reflected some sort of consciousness of guilt. The other surprising thing about this case, without criticising anybody, but there was no psychiatric evaluation of Farquharson. 3 deaths, convicted of 3 murders effectively, and no psychiatric evaluation of the accused person. And what I would suggest respectfully is a minimal psychological evaluation of the accused person. Normally in cases like this, the defence would retain a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and the Crown may then seek to have the person evaluated on the basis of the findings of those experts. Sometimes they'll agree. Where there's an agreement of an insanity defence, and I've had a number of cases where the Crown say, yeah, we agree with you, the person was floridly crazy, to put it in street terms. So in a case like this, 3 dead boys, young age, a backdrop of marital discord or breakdown, although I think the access arrangements were reasonably amicable as I understand it. Why wasn't he evaluated by either the Crown or the defence? I don't quite understand that process.
That's what that's what struck me actually when I think both you and I, Tim, spoke to a journalist about this when it all kind of started to come back out in the media. And that was my first question. Well, what did the psych report say? Given that basically this case comes down to, you know, the stress, etc., that he felt on that day and his emotional response to what had happened, to the extreme extent that he would intentionally drown 3 children. And I was like, what did it say? And he was like, well, I've read everything and there isn't one. And I was like, what do you mean there isn't one? And I was blown away by that, given the context of the case.
I would imagine if he's given leave to appeal, and that's not a given, but if he is given leave, and there is a retrial, it may be worthwhile looking at what was going on in his head at the time.
How would you backtrack that now?
I think it's a very good question, and it's a valid question. At the best you can do is a retrospective opinion. And, you know, this question is often put to experts. Well, you weren't there at the time. You're talking about the individual now. How can you possibly comment on their mental state? This is why it's always advisable for someone, if they're willing to be examined, to have them assessed as close to the alleged offence as possible, so you get some insight. But look, I don't know Farquharson's background. I'm not commenting about his mental state. But I would imagine that there would be some sort of evaluation of what was going on in his life at that time. Were there expressions of homicidal intent? And of course, the other thing that's been raised in this case, I mean, I've watched a couple of documentaries on it, I've read about it. The testimonials of people who claim to have had conversations with him and others, eyewitnesses, have all been challenged in terms of their reliability and validity. And, you know, the research says that there's no such thing as a perfect memory, that we're all subject to external subjective influences. I mean, just try and think what you did last week, tell someone else what you did last week, and then get the third person to tell you what you did last week, the old Chinese whisper, and there's no such thing really as an absolutely valid memory. So it seems to me there's a lot of evidentiary issues that would need to be explored further if Farquharson was granted another trial.
We're talking 20 years ago. So those memories, even if they were accurate at the time, will have changed. It's a high profile case that could have affected people's memories subconsciously other things they've heard, impressions that have been overlaid, other people's opinions.
I remember doing a case years and years ago, one of my first criminal defences, which we fortunately were successful in too, and we put together a chart of contamination of the witnesses. And day one, actually, as an investigator, when you go out to a scene and you interview the witnesses, you'll find that a lot of the eyewitnesses have very different recollections at that day one. So imagine as that progresses, and this is where the contamination of evidence comes in, the number of times they're interviewed by cops, lawyers, and so on, journalists even, their recollections, their interactions with other people, sharing stories, for example, and that occasionally wonky day one recollection will get very, very different as it progresses. So by the time 20 years later, good luck.
Well, they may have read books about the case or watched documentaries about it or anything that could have further flavored what they thought, put new images literally in their mind of what they saw, what they heard, who they spoke to, and they may be telling their truth, but it actually may have very little to do with the reality of what actually happened.
And that's why, as an investigator, when you're trying to reconstruct these things, for example, for an appeal, you go back to the very, very basics of what you can establish. And quite often that's physical evidence, the geography, the timeline always important, and then get your experts involved. And point I make, in all these cases, one of the early things you have to do is make sure that the expert who's giving you their expert opinion is an expert in the field they're giving the opinion on. Go back to my day one case. It sticks in my mind 40 years later. A very high profile case in Australia. Police put together an expert, a professor from Sydney University, absolutely impeccable, but he had no expertise in the area he was giving evidence in. And the learned professor who gave his evidence lasted about 2 or 3 minutes into examination by the defence barrister, because we proved comprehensively that whilst he was learned, he had no expertise, no education, no practice, no nothing in the field he was about to give expertise on, even though he thought he did.
No experience. So that's what you need,
No.
isn't it?
Well, in this case, it was a paediatrician giving evidence in psychology. Good luck with that.
There's been other examples of that. We won't explore them right now.
Sort of case, I go to Tim to have my knee fixed.
Yeah. Well, I could probably fix it because, I'm generically capable, but I hear you. Look,
Yeah.
the other thing, of course, is the cough syncope. And there was a lot of contentious evidence which was debated about cough syncope. One expert said, look, this is absolutely plausible. Other experts said it's just a cook-up. But there's been other examples recently, or more recent to this case. There was one of a truck driver who his defence was cough syncope. And he actually was on a hands-free mobile phone at the time that he had the coughing attack. He lost control of his vehicle. Tragically, a number of people were killed as a consequence. And on appeal, it was accepted that this is real, it can happen, and so on. So I think your point, Duncan, just to finish on that, your point on that is you've got to have the right expert and they've got to know what they're talking about.
Yeah. So first time he was actually found guilty, the truck driver.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting, because there's secondary corroborative evidence that it happened. If he's on the phone, there's a witness to it having happened. So that's interesting. But to your point of expert evidence, absolutely, it's not enough to be an expert in one thing. You have to be an expert in that thing and have experience, training, etc., in that particular field. And you have to be able to demonstrate both that you're an expert and that you're an expert specifically in that evidence type.
Yeah. And I think it's something you probably know better than most. Expert evidence, if accepted, isn't set in stone. Science progresses dramatically.
Your duty as an expert to the court is to be across the scientific evidence, data, etc., that's available to you when you give your evidence. But we do know that things change. If there's something fundamental that you don't know at the time, that's obviously highly problematic. You can't be an expert if you're not across the most recent.
Well, you have to stick to your knitting. And, when I was previously lecturing, I was once an academic, sort of, I would say to students, stick to your knitting, don't go beyond the province of your expertise, because you'll be mowed down immediately. stick to what you know. The other interesting one is recovered memory syndrome.
Yeah.
This was very much in vogue, 10, 20 years ago, where people under hypnosis, which is highly suggestible, were saying, look, I don't understand why I'm so distressed all the time, and they would be put under hypnosis, and then bingo, well, you were sexually abused as a child, or you were sexually interfered with by people. And that became incredibly controversial. And again, there's no such thing as perfect memory. And then when you've got somebody guiding you through a hypnotic voyage about what might have occurred, you're talking about contamination factors, Duncan.
Yep.
That's a classic example of what can happen. And this kind of expertise needs to be challenged, I think.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, and we've all given expert evidence at some stage in our careers. That expert evidence is state of the art at the time we give it. Science progresses, things will change. It's not set in stone. And on the flip side of all this, we're seeing remarkable advances in investigation, cold cases being resuscitated and solved years later because of the advance of science. So in the case of Farquharson, if there's genuine expert evidence that contemporary science dispels what we heard 20 years ago, then the case has to be re-examined, and it has to be re-examined in the light of contemporary science.
Well, look at what happened with Folbig. We had a woman who was prosecuted for the murder of 3 babies, the manslaughter of a 4th over a 10-year period in 1989 to 1999. She spent 20 years in prison. Now, questions were raised by a number of people over the veracity and the reliability of the evidence. However, it took the science until 2022, 2023 to prove that Laura and Sarah, the 2 daughters, died as a result of a genetic mutation which led to their early death. So what many of us were saying was clear from the evidence. It's not reliable beyond reasonable doubt. It took that long for the science to come forward and prove what some of us already knew.
Yeah, and generically speaking, it can work the other way. Science may prove that this was not real. You have to rely on the science. There may be things that don't eventuate because of science. But in her case, she was very, very fortunate that advances in science and technology assisted her. And then she was further supported by a group of highly eminent scientists. And that was enough to give it the momentum to get her out of jail.
But it's rare for scientists to do that. So they obviously felt very strongly in that case that there was a miscarriage of justice. And the fact that there's been several calls in the Farquharson matter to review the evidence shows that some people of high status, highly qualified, are concerned about the reliability of this.
And bearing in mind the burden of proof in a criminal matter is beyond reasonable doubt. And so if you have new scientific evidence that raises doubt, then you're entitled to not be convicted, correct?
It's not easy to get appeals.
I think we've all been involved in these over the years as well, trying to have a review of someone who's been convicted. It is an uphill battle.
Very much so.
But at the same time, with that support of the scientific community and lawyers who are happy to actually involve themselves in it, it can be done. You've just got to get it before a tribunal for them to have a look objectively at it and decide what to do next. And
it's very hard, though. The law likes finality. It doesn't like going backwards and looking at things, especially when there could have been an error, because then it has to accept that it got it wrong.
But the way we apply the law has to change, simply because science is advancing so quickly and so definitively that there will be cases that will come up that science can dispel that original conviction or cast doubt. We've got to be more flexible. And I think, just as a side for me too, we've actually got to have access where there is a genuine reason for doing this, that the convicted people can be supported better than they are. At the moment, it's pro bono if they're lucky. To get that level of interest up.
My song, Duncan. I would love to see an independent criminal case review commission in Australia, as they have in Canada, the UK for over 25 years, New Zealand, to independently look at these cases, separate from the judiciary, separate to no, entirely independent. So there is a place of recourse, because miscarriages do happen.
Yeah, as opposed to ragtag bunch of people that include some of us on occasions. Trying to fight very hard, but at a scientific and expert level and a media level to try and get some justice in a case that is so obviously wrong. I mean, courts get it right so often, but just occasionally there is something that causes you to raise your eyebrows. And those people in that circumstances need that support. And, you know, with the advances in science, particularly these days, we need, I agree with you, we need to have that mechanism where they can get the right support they need to objectively review the case and think, is there something we need to go back to court on?
It doesn't mean it's going to open a floodgate.
No.
Each case will be treated with on its merits, as it should be.
Yeah, everyone has. But actually, that is when in other countries where they've established these independent review commissions, that has not been the outcome. There's been a trick court. It's been manageable. So there's no reason to assume that that would happen in Australia. Yeah.
Regrettably, with Australia, and this is something I am critical of and have been for many years, we tend to be very slow to adapt changes, particularly, I mean, thinking of my own career in New South Wales. DNA was something the New South Wales police were scratching their heads about for years, that they didn't want to be the first. When it becomes overwhelming, we'll hop on the bandwagon.
Well, look at rail gauge in Australia, for example.
Good point, yes.
You know, I'm old enough to recall that when you caught a train from Sydney to Melbourne, in the olden days, you had to disembark at Albury and cross the river and get on a different train. We didn't get standardised rail gauge for a long time because of egos and stupidity. And we see it all the time. We've commented on it many times about I think it's improving, but the lack of cooperation between state law enforcement, federal law enforcement, the lack of sharing of communication and so on. It continues to be a problem. And I think you made the comment on our last episode, Duncan, that the best way to avoid a crime in the olden days was just to hop the border.
Yep. And at the end of all this, I can't conceive of anything more appalling for a person to be wrongly convicted and look forward to spending the rest of their life behind bars, knowing that they are innocent. And in some cases, particularly when they're a child murder, even worse, they've lost their families, they've lost their livelihood, they've lost everything. And I just can't conceive of how appalling that must be.
Absolutely appalling. And then if you are convicted of killing children, I can tell you your life in prison is hell on steroids. You spend most of your time in isolation on protection, and it's not just the deprivation of liberty that you experience. That's just the beginning of your punishment. Every day is cruel and punishing. So it's a very useful discussion. It'll be interesting to see what happens with Farquharson. He certainly has, I think, a groundswell of support growing, referable to reasonable doubt, and the evidence surrounding his conviction.
So hopefully in the next couple of months, we'll see some formal documentation lodged, which can start the review process. A judge will be put aside to go and review it, and the judge will then decide on the next steps, sort of thing. There's a whole range of things that can happen, but I think in the next couple of months, hopefully the documentation will be in front of a judicial officer, a highly experienced judicial officer, who can have a look at it and scratch their heads and decide what the next step might be.
Now, the added degree of difficulty potentially is there's been 2 unsuccessful appeals to date. I would imagine that it would need to be very compelling new evidence, facts and circumstances for them to even consider it.
Yeah, I take some heart from the case that we were involved in a few years ago. It's a matter of Scott Ostick, who was convicted of murder. He had multiple appeals, reviews, blah, 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 blah. And it wasn't until 12 years into his sentence for murder that a combination of some lawyers who were on his case, some forensic experts of the highest caliber and contemporary evidence, and a pile of journalists as well, pushed and pushed and pushed. And eventually the Western Australian government reviewed that finding. Reluctantly, yes, they weren't happy with it.
No, they were not happy about that.
And rather than release this poor bloke, they flung it back for yet another trial. They were hanging on to that conviction as hard as they could. The jury were out for 3 hours at that trial, time for a Scotch finger and a cup of tea, and they came back and acquitted Scott Ostick. He walked free that day for the first time in 12 years. Contemporary science is actually what nailed that case. Yeah.
And if you want to go further west from Sydney and Melbourne, or further east from Perth, Xanthan and I have had some very interesting discussions recently about what goes on or what went on in South Australia with their disgraced so-called forensic pathologist.
Colin Manock.
Yes, the expert who wasn't an expert.
Yeah, which is where we started this discussion, isn't it?
Yeah.
Stay within your wheelhouse. He had no qualifications in pathology, and he did 10,000 postmortems across his career. Like, that it still blows my mind.
Competent GP, no doubt, possibly, but would you unleash him on brain surgery? Obviously, the South Australian government didn't check the references properly.
No, they knew. No.
Oh, they just didn't want to lose, you know.
They didn't have a better person to put in that role, so he got the job. They absolutely knew he was unqualified when they employed him. Yeah,
for such an incredible, all medical specialties have with them a huge importance. This bloke, actually, his findings were going to court.
Yeah, or not, in that he was finding that people were not, a case was not suspicious when in fact it was. So it went both ways. Some people who should be in prison aren't, and some people who are in prison shouldn't be.
Welcome to Adelaide. Thank you, everyone. Now, coming up in our next episode, we'll take you into the mind and the appalling deeds of the Australian-born sexual predator and serial killer, Christopher Wilder. He's a red-hot suspect for Sydney's Wanda Beach murders, one of Australia's most challenging cold cases, and for a homicidal rampage across the United States of America. But decades after his death, some of his victims are finally being identified thanks to contemporary science, and even now, another possible victim has emerged. Thanks everyone for watching Inside Crime, the Experts, and see you next time. And please remember to like our channel and subscribe.